A reading from the book of Exodus. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, "I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up." When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." He said further, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. But Moses said to God, "If I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." He said further, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, 'I am has sent me to you.'" The word of the Lord. The Holy Gospel according to St. John.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Your ancestor Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. Then the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" Jesus said to them, "Very truly, I tell you, before Abraham was, I am." So they picked up stones to throw at him. But Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
With a video introduction to our sermon series. Today we continue our sermon series on John, the Gospel of Light and Life. So far we've looked at the Word made flesh, the miraculous signs of Jesus, and today we took a look at the I am sayings of Jesus. And John gives us kind of a purpose statement for his whole gospel in chapter 20, and there we hear the testimony of Jesus' life that John gives us is so that you may believe in who Jesus is and then receive the life that Jesus gives. Last week, we looked at the miraculous signs of Jesus and how the miracles in John's gospel are called signs because the significance of them points to something beyond the miracle themselves. It points to who Jesus is and the ways that Jesus gives life to those who believe in him. So as we're working through John, we're kind of asking ourselves three questions. Who is this man, Jesus? How does this affect my life? And what response am I called to? Before we dive into the I am sayings of Jesus, it's helpful for us to look at the significance of that phrase, I am. And we heard that in our first reading for today, which was from Exodus 3. And at this time, the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt. Moses had fled to the Sinai desert. And when Moses had this powerful and holy encounter with God, and there he is, he sees the burning bush, and God speaks to him, and then God tells Moses that he's seen the suffering of his people in Egypt and that he has come to deliver them. God tells Moses, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses isn't sure about this, but God reassures him, I will be with you. And then it goes on where Moses asks, well, who am I supposed to say is sending me? Which God, right? And then also, what name am I to give? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. This is my name forever. And so here God tells Moses that his name is I am who I am, or I am. And the Hebrew word here is Yahweh, or sometimes it's pronounced Jehovah. And throughout the Old Testament, this is the personal and holy name of God. I am. I am being itself. I am the source of life itself. Everything receives its existence through me, God is saying. This is the holy name for God as well. In fact, it was seen as so holy that the people would not even speak the name. So if you read through the scriptures, if that was your job to read the scroll, when you encountered the holy name of God, it was actually written in a different font or script so that it would draw your attention and that you would not accidentally speak or pronounce the name of God, but instead would substitute that with a title for God. And so Adonai, which means Lord. And even today, if you look at many of our Old Testament books of the Bible, if you see Lord in all capitals, that is actually the Hebrew word for Yahweh, the proper name, the personal name for God, the holy name for God. And if it's Lord in kind of spelled normally with lowercase O-R-D, then that actually is the translation for Adonai, Lord. It was seen as so holy, this proper name for God. And so in the Gospel of John, Jesus speaks of himself as I am, identifying himself with the divine name that God gave Moses. And so we hear of one of those times in our gospel reading from John, which we had today. And to keep in mind that Abraham would have lived 16 to 18 centuries before Jesus when Jesus speaks these words. And then he says, very truly, I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. And so he's identifying himself with the divine name for God. Jesus saying I am in this absolute way was so controversial that the people pick up stones to stone him to death because that was the punishment for blasphemy. He's revealing that he is one with God, that he is one with the Creator God. And remember that from John chapter 1, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago, the Word was with God and in the beginning, and everything came into being through the Word, and the Word has become flesh in Jesus Christ. So Jesus Christ was with God in the beginning, right? It's kind of bringing it back. And there are 7 times within John where Jesus uses I am in this way, in kind of this absolute way. And the Greek phrase for that is ego eimi, but it means I am. And so still had that weight of significance of saying I am. And there's also 7 sayings of Jesus where Jesus uses the term I am followed by a metaphor. And we call those the 7 I am sayings or statements of Jesus. And we see those there. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. And all of these point to who Jesus is and how Jesus gives life. And so we're going to dive deeper into 3 of those I am sayings today. And the first is, I am the bread of life. And so as Jesus is saying this, he's communicating, one, that he is one with God, I am, this kind of bold statement, but also that he is the source of life. The bread points to the provision that God provided while the Israelites wandered in the wilderness. God provided manna from heaven so that they could survive one day at a time, right? This was provided each day, but they couldn't keep it to another day. But here Jesus expands on this when he says, very truly I tell you, whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. So God sent Jesus into the world to be the bread of life from heaven so that we might believe in Jesus and invite him into our lives, both spiritually and physically, and receive life forever. So the Latin word for breaking bread is, I'm going to probably mispronounce it, but companere, which is how we get the word companion. So breaking bread is kind of how people are brought together, how people are bound together is in the breaking of bread and sharing a meal together. And so as we receive the bread in Holy Communion, we are brought into companionship, into communion with God and with one another. Jesus says, those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have eternal life. They abide in me, and I in them. This is the bread that came down from heaven. So he's, again, identifying himself as the bread that came down from heaven. So that's a little taste of that. We're going to look at 3 of these, but you can dive into each of these quite deeply if you wanted to as well. The second I am saying that we're looking at today is I am the light of the world, Jesus says. When the Israelites were wandering in the desert, they were led by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And so they could travel, whether it was day or night. And that was a symbol of God's presence with them and God guiding them. In Jesus' time, they would remember that during the festival of Sukkot by lighting 4 giant lampstands, each 75 feet tall. This would be done in the temple. And each lampstand would have 4 big bowls filled with oil with large amount of fabric coming up as a wick. And they would light these at night, and it would say that it was dramatically light up Jerusalem. And if you could imagine that at a time when there was no electricity, there is no search beams or the kinds of things that we see lighting the sky today, probably no outside lighting of much of any kind, to have this beam of light, of lights coming from the temple. And this was a way to celebrate what God had done in guiding the people and God's presence with the people as they wandered in the wilderness. And so Jesus is saying these words in that same court in the temple during this time of celebration when he says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me won't walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So that's how Jesus is introducing this I am statement in this dramatic way, in saying that Jesus now is God's presence with us and is our guide. And so with this powerful story, we learn that Jesus is the one who guides us through the darkness. Jesus is the one who comes to dispel the darkness. And then also we see this last part, right? Those who follow me will have the light of life. And so Jesus gives us the light of life to carry into the world. And how we face really dark situations in our lives is different, is impacted by the fact that we know that Jesus is the light of the world. In John, Jesus says that, I am the light of the world. But it's interesting to note that in Matthew, Jesus says, you are the light of the world. Right? So, we're given this light of life to carry into the world. As we said even in our baptism this morning, right? Let your light so shine before others that they may see your good works and glorify your God in heaven. That's one of the things that we're called to, is to bear that light into the world. And so as we think about that, what might that look like for us as we are the light of life bearers in the world? I think of some of the different disasters that are going on right now. People who have lost homes through flooding or through cyclones in Africa and great devastation. And I think of a family that showed up in a shelter in Nebraska having lost their home, and they show up and they say, what can we do? How can we help? How can we serve others in the midst of their own tragedy, right? Just coming ready to help. I think of our different mission partners and the work that they do, and should have lifted that up, but there is an update about Camp Chisomo on a pink insert here. I invite you to read that through. But Camp Chisomo is a place where kids who have been orphaned, forced to grow up too fast, and Camp Chisomo provides a safe place for those kids to be kids and to hear about God's love for them. And so as we partner with our different mission partners, we get to be a part of Christ's light in the lives of others. Or you think of Marian Cares and showing the love of Jesus in very practical ways through meals, through tutoring, through Christian education, through loving adult mentors, or through tutoring at the Catherine McCulley Center, providing hope to succeed in life when you don't know the language. Think of our jail ministry, sharing the truth and grace of Jesus Christ through Bible study with the women at our Lynn County Jail. I think there's lots of opportunities to share the light of Christ in our daily lives as well, to speak a word of love and acceptance to someone who is discouraged or has been excluded, bringing a meal to someone who has been in the hospital or facing a cancer diagnosis, sharing the truth of God's love and acceptance with someone who has been bullied or been made fun of, working for peace and unity and explaining other people's actions in the best possible way in the midst of a culture around us that is of division and violence. And also sometimes speaking up, speaking out injustice, speaking and naming injustice and evil things for what they are, shedding light on areas of darkness. And again, we can do this in our daily lives. I was driving home from church on Wednesday night, and Mike and I have made this trip back and forth to Strawberry Point, to Marion many, many times. I feel like I've been prideful about the fact that I've been vigilant, watching for deer. But Wednesday night, we hit a deer on our way home, and I was kind of in shock. You feel bad that you did this, and but we were pulled off. Then we got to a safe place off side of the road, and the fluids were leaking, and it wasn't going to be safe to drive. But the way in which my husband then came to get us, and the way in which he provided, right, love and care. He was the one who was moving things from one car to another, helping while I was on the phone. Just in our daily life as a spouse, we can bring the light of Christ to where we are. Or thinking of, in the midst of someone's occupation, the comforting words of the police officers when they arrived, and when I'm still a little frazzled, that they brought light to a dark situation for me. Or even the AAA person that I talked with on the phone, the very first one, and told her I've got a toddler in the car and I'm 8 months pregnant, and just her calming voice, right? That's her job. But to do that in a way that shares light with someone going through a difficult time. And again, I know that that's a small inconvenience in the scope of what other people are facing. But to know, and even in these small ways, we can bring light to where we are in the world. The third I am statement we're looking at today is I am the good shepherd. And shepherds would literally lay down their life for their sheep. So here we have literally, it's hard to see, but there's actually a person in the gate, in the opening there, protecting from predators. And so again, we see Jesus saying, I lay down my life for the sheep. So this teaches us that Jesus is the one who does that for us. And Jesus is also the one who cares for us and knows us and claims us. There's a man, Tim Laniak, who spent a year doing research among the Bedouin tribes of Israel and Jordan and Sinai. So these are people that currently kind of nomadically care for sheep as they travel. And he tells stories that reveal the way that a shepherd knows his flock or her flock and cares for them. So he writes, in an interview I had with Abu Manur, I asked him how much contact he had with his flock of 2,000. Here was a man with 2 separate homes, people he was able to pay to take care of the sheep, different sub-flocks he had, and he clearly didn't need to be out with the sheep. But his answer surprised me. He said, I am with them every day. In the summer, I sleep outside with them. If I weren't with them every day, I shouldn't be their shepherd. What an amazing bond you see there between the shepherd and the sheep. The sheep know that they belong to a shepherd. They are named, known, and counted every day. He goes on to another story. Once you begin to fathom how many times an animal may have been counted, checked, rescued, protected, milked, and shorn, it dawns on you why the Bedouin always say they are family. He tells a story of reuniting lambs with their mothers. And the mothers, which were 51, 42 sheep and 9 goats, were kept back from the lambs by Falah and Salim, while Nasir began to call them by name. And as each was allowed to come up, Nasir slipped off kind of the noose that had been on the lamb and paired that with the mom so that a little lamb could nurse. And this was all done in the midst of the mothers bawling and the lambs crying for food. But what was kind of astonishing was that he was calling up each mother and picking out her lamb in complete darkness. So all through this process of the loud noises, its darkness, he said it looked like to me like a pandemonium. But for them, it was everyday procedure that he could recognize each mother and each baby by the feel with his eyes shut. All were black, but by feeling heads and backs, he knew by touch which one was which. And to think of the knowing then we see in that kind of relationship between a shepherd and sheep. And here Jesus is saying, I am the good shepherd. I'm the good shepherd for you. Jesus knows you and cares for you. Jesus calls us by name and invites us to follow him. And this is about belonging, as I talked about, we talked about in the baptism. It's about belonging. In our schools, oftentimes there can be a lot of emphasis on who is in and who is out. It seems to matter, what your clothes look like, what cell phone you have or don't have, what car you drive or your parents drive, whether you're good at sports or dance or schoolwork or music. And all these can be ways to divide and exclude. And adults, if we're honest, I think that doesn't stop at school. There can be a lot of places of judgment and division in the places where we gather to socialize and in our workplaces. And so this metaphor that Jesus is lifting up to describe himself is bold, and that Jesus is claiming to be one with God, but it also is also bold in that it lifts up an identity of belonging to Jesus and in being cared for in an intimate way. And that can be a grounding point for us in the midst of divisions and cliques around us, that you belong, that you are loved, that no matter what the world might say, because Jesus reveals the heart of God for you. Jesus is truly God come to earth, and Jesus is the good shepherd who knows you, taking you into his arms, naming you, and inviting you to an exciting relationship of following him and relationship with him. And so Jesus gives us peace and acceptance in the midst of a stressful world. And the belonging and acceptance that we receive from Jesus is something that we can share with others and help them to know and experience as well. Inviting others to join you as you live out your life of faith, refraining from judgment, refraining from excluding others and causing divisions, welcoming others and embracing the unique gifts that each person brings. And so as we've been, again, reading John, we're asking ourselves 3 questions. Who is this man Jesus? And today, in these 3 I am sayings, we've learned that Jesus is the source of life. Jesus is God's presence with us and our guide. Jesus is the one who lays down his life for us, who knows us, cares for us, and claims us. And we're asking, how does this affect my life? We are brought into communion with God. We have the presence of God with us in Jesus Christ. We are not alone, and Jesus is our God. And we experience belonging and acceptance in a deep, knowing way in Jesus Christ. And so what response are we called to to respond in belief, to trust that Jesus is who Jesus claims to be, and to live in communion with him, to take him into your life in Holy Communion, to take and eat and live in communion with Jesus Christ. To remember that you have been given the light of life, and to boldly carry that light into the world, and to help others to know and experience the belonging and acceptance that relationship with Jesus provides. And so now I want to invite you to sing a prayer together. This is our hymn of the day, Christ, be our light, and make us into a light for the world to see. I invite you to stand now.